From misplats of the spot to record-breaking frames, from two greats colliding to the second youngest world snooker champion in the modern era, the Crucible threw up yet another world championship full of drama and talking points. And now that the dust has settled on the tournament, I'm going to look back at what was arguably one of the best world championships that we've had in recent years. I did speak a little about the tournament in a recent video with Bayes Breakdown, who kindly had me on his channel to discuss some of the key talking points. And if you're new to this channel from that video, then welcome in, take a seat, and let's digest the main moments from this year's tournament. And we'll start at the beginning, the first round, and on paper, it looked like it offered plenty of banana skins for the seeds. Even with players like Jack Lazowski, Stuart Bingham, Stephen Maguire, Chang Bing Yu, amongst others not qualifying, we still had a pretty strong last 32 draw. But the bloodbath for the seeds that often the opening round at the Crucible is, that never materialised this year, as only Hussein Fafayi got through to the second round with his win against Sishai Wei, as the tournament equalled a record of 15 seeds getting through the first round. There were some close calls. Murphy had to produce one of the breaks of his life to beat Fan in a deciding frame. Kyron Wilson had to rely on his young opponent, Stan Moody, showing off his vast inexperience to throw away a 7-3 lead on his debut. John Higgins let an early 4-0 lead slip to a 5-4 deficit against Carter before coming back to win quite convincingly. And even Sao Sing Tong suffered the opening day Crucible nerves in an edgy 10-7 win over Liam Highfield. But in general, the seeds enjoyed smooth passage in what was a slightly disappointing start to the tournament in terms of drama. But then the tournament really did feel like it came alive from that middle weekend when we saw edition number 7 of the Crucible rivalry between two greats of O'Sullivan and Higgins. Higgins, of course, had a quarterfinal classic last year against Mark Williams, which went to a deciding frame, and we were all hoping that this match would follow suit. But after 1.5 sessions of the match, it looked like O'Sullivan was on course for a fairly comfortable win when he led 9-4. And it was at that point that the tide began to change. Ronnie began misfiring when he had chances to extend his second session lead even further. And once Higgins got back to just 7-9 behind, he produced a pretty timeless session of snooker, making breaks of 118, 128, 111 and 88 to come back and win 13-12. A result which just did not look likely halfway through the match when Ronnie was queuing like a dream and Higgins honestly looked all at sea. But it served as yet another reminder as to why the longer session matches are the pinnacle of this sport. One consequence of so many big names getting through to round 2 meant that a lot of them found themselves on a collision course against one another as we got to the last 16 stage. And it wasn't just O'Sullivan that fell foul to this. The world number 3, Kyron Wilson, succumbed to a 13-9 second round defeat to Mark Allen. Mark Williams suffered the same scoreline against Barry Hawkins. Then he had Mark Selby, who had looked so strong in the first round, then lost his way a touch in a 13-11 defeat against Wu Yize. Ding Junhui faced up against his compatriot that stole his crown, and despite looking very much up for the fight, still didn't have enough to come through. And then Judd Trump suffered maybe the biggest surprise of the round in a deciding frame defeat to Hussein Fafayi, meaning an Iranian beat a Trump in 2026. Who would have thought it, huh? So here I am at my least favourite part of the video, Neil Robertson and his annual disappointment at the Crucible. If I go back 9 years to when he lost to Moko Fu in the second round, in my frustration, I declared that this man would never win a second world title. And whilst after a while I did think that it was a sort of heat of the moment thing said in frustration, the longer time has gone on, the more and more realistic that seems. And it is just the same old story. I go into a world championship expecting disappointment because I've seen it all before, for the past 16 years now. And then I see him win a match or two and I start to have hope, only to see him crumble at the quarterfinal stage. This was his 10th quarterfinal appearance here and his 7th quarterfinal loss and his 5th in a row since 2015. I talked about this subject with Tom on his channel, and this mental block that he seems to have at the crucible, because I really would just love to get inside this man's head, because he knows himself what has held himself back, and he knows what he's done wrong in the past, but still he repeated those bad habits against Higgins in a match where it just felt like if he could have tried to attack a bit more from frame one, I think he could have won fairly comfortably, because Higgins was on a come down from his win against Ronnie, and Higgins was making mistake after mistake in that match, and Neil just couldn't capitalise. And yes, look, the balls went scrappy, and that's no one's fault, that can happen. But I just feel like Neil just allowed that match to keep going into that pattern and didn't really try anything different to stop it. And unfortunately though, this was just another example amongst many others over the past 15 years as to why this man, as great as he is, just cannot perform on the biggest stage of all. Elsewhere at the quarterfinal stage, the snooker gods decided they had had enough of all of those who were silly enough to doubt that the curse existed and think that Sing Tong could successfully defend his title, as Shaun Murphy put pain to his defence here. Still though, it was a pretty decent effort from Zhao, but as is always the case for a first-time world champion here, he just struggled to find anywhere near his best on a consistent basis, and we know that when that A game of his isn't firing, he doesn't have an awful much else to fall back on. Hawkins and Allen also put on one of the matches of the tournament, especially in the second session, which Hendry would have described as an exhibition of break building. And Barry could probably count himself a little unlucky to have lost here, because he was looking very strong all tournament and may have fancied his chances of going the distance with the way that he was playing. But just that little bit of carelessness right at the end when he tried to snooker Allen behind a pink, only to end up snookering himself, sort of cost him in the end. Still though, whilst many will look back at the final 3 matches of this tournament in years to come, this may have been the highest quality match of the lot. And speaking of Mark Allen, that neatly leads us on to, well, this. Despite the grit and determination he showed to reach a 3rd career Crucible semi-final, unfortunately his tournament can only be remembered through this one moment. After slogging it out against Wu Yize in a match that contained the longest frame of snooker ever played at the Crucible, a frame that I'm both grateful and gutted to have missed at the same time, Mark finally earned himself a shot at reaching a maiden world championship final. And let's face it, he couldn't have hoped for an easier shot to achieve that dream. But to throw in a twitchy one right at this moment, one of the biggest moments of his career, is mortifying. And you cannot help but feel for him, because this moment could really go either one or two ways. It either becomes a battle scar that is just too hard to get rid of, and a moment he'll think about every time he walks back out onto the Crucible floor, or he uses it as painful motivation to come back even stronger in future years. And I'd hope it's the latter personally, because Mark is definitely in the conversation as being one of the best players at the moment to have never landed a Crucible crown. The weird pattern that Shaun Murphy has at the World Championship continued this year. So often this man falls at the first or second round of the tournament, but if he can get through the first week, invariably he goes all the way to the final, and yet again that proved to be the case this year. He was one frame away from losing in the first round, and then in a cruel twist of fate ended up being one frame away from a second world title. But I think this was a slightly different Murphy than the man we saw in both 2015 and 2021, the last 2 times he reached the final. You know, that man blitzed his way to the finals with just savage potting and break building. But this year he really had to dig in and fight his way through the draw. He was way below his best in the first round, but the clearance he produced to come through the decider was, as he said himself, one of the very best that he has ever produced. He then steamrolled Zhao Guodong with the confidence of a man who possibly knew he should have already been back at home and out of the tournament. But the performances in the quarters and the semi-finals stood out for me. He struggled to get control of his match against Sing Tong until the final session, and from 8-all, really did power his way to the finish line rather than shrinking away from it. And then the same against Higgins really. For 3 sessions, he was sucked into the same trap that Neil Robertson had found himself in the previous round, where the frames went scrappy and both players struggled to find any sort of rhythm. And he found himself going into the final session behind, when really he had plenty enough chances to have been comfortably ahead in that match. But again, he managed to brush that aside and saved his very best for the final session, knocking in 3 centuries to come through 17-15. The loss in the final will sting though, and could arguably be the most painful of the 4 losses he now has in Crucible finals since winning it 21 years ago. And to not even get a chance in the deciding frame was brutal, especially after stealing the frame before to make it go the distance. You know, when you're at the Crucible and it's 17 or something that rarely ever happens, he would have expected at least half a chance, but he never got that. He maybe would have wanted to have had a bit more control against his younger, vastly inexperienced opponent. But look, both Selby and Allen couldn't contain him, and they are much more safety orientated than Shaun, so I wouldn't be holding that against him at all. His new break-off perhaps gifted Wu with too many early openings into frames, but it would have been a sign of weakness for Shaun if he stopped doing it just because his opponent was knocking them in off the lampshades. So I don't really blame him for not changing something that had worked so well for him all the way through the tournament up until that point. Ultimately though, he was involved in a Crucible Classic, a match that will be talked about for many years to come. The first decider in a final in 24 years, and he just came up a little bit short. The question will now be, how many more cracks will he have at winning a second world title? And now finally to the man of the moment. You wait 2 decades for a Chinese world champion, waiting for Ding Junhui to achieve the hopes of a nation, and then 2 youngsters come along in successive years to steal his thunder. It was almost a rinse and repeat of what we saw from Xing Tong 12 months ago, a fearless potter who went for everything and got a high percentage of the long reds that he went for, scored heavy, and didn't get involved in much of the tactical side of things. And things are changing in the snooker world. World champions are not just built upon those with the best durability for the 17-day marathon anymore. Instead, 3 of the last 4 world champions have been players who have stepped into the venue and attacked from session 1 to session 16. Luca won it with a brand of snooker we had not really ever seen before in 2023. Xing Tong then built upon that last year, and Wu Yize this year has copied that template again. We saw players like Trump, like Robertson, like Allen, who all clearly have scars from this tournament and all go into their shells a bit. But this young man played with the exuberance of youth. He had no fear, no painful memories lingering in the background. He just came here with the confidence of a man who had won his first ranking title this season and carried that through 17 days of snooker. But I think what impressed me the most from him was how he responded to the bad sessions that he had. For 3 matches, he almost looked invincible. And then for the first time in the tournament, he showed weakness in the second session against Mark Allen in the semi-finals, seeing his 6-2 lead disappear after losing 5 on the spin. And oddly enough, that 100-minute frame actually helped him more than his opponent. And you could have been forgiven for thinking that he had finally hit a wall. But no, he found his form again in the next 2 sessions. And whilst of course that missed black from Allen played a huge part in his success, he never lost that self-belief. And again, in the final, he lost 5 in a row when he led 10-7 to then be 12-10 behind. Again, he didn't shrink from that setback and just casually rediscovered his form again to get right back on track. And it was just a remarkable 2 weeks. I'll be completely honest, I did not think that he was ready for this. I thought that this tournament had come a few years too early to even consider him to be a contender. But like I say, I'm having to reconsider what a potential world champion looks like in the modern game in the 2020s, because it's not what I saw growing up in the 2000s and the 2010s, when it was who had the most stamina to last. It now seems to be who can get on a roll and attack their opponents into submission, and who can pot and score the heaviest, which is something to think about next season. For now though, the Crucible has its 25th different world champion, its second youngest world champion, and at the age of just 22, a man who has the potential to win here on numerous further occasions.